Chapter 9. Hanford wasted no time in radioing Magic as well as Aviano intel that he had found me alive, safe, and apparently in decent shape physically, considering my 6 days on the run. Word was quickly delayed to the Pentagon, as well as NATO headquarters in Vicenza, Italy, where it was around 2 a.m. The NATO officers in Vicenza were startled. They had been sending French and British jets on secret sorties over Bosnia since my plane had been shot down, but like the regular search and rescue teams from Aviano, the pilots had found no evidence I was alive. With the unexpected news from Hanford, the Vicenza command jumped into action. Even before I had been shot down, tensions in Bosnia had increased over the last weeks. When the Bosnian Serbs had captured the 350 NATO military observers and made them prisoners of war, NATO had placed on alert the 24th United States Marine Expeditionary Unit, a crack troubleshooting team called up to handle tough situations around the world. Part of the 24th Expeditionary Unit was the 42-member TRAP Force, Tactical Recovery Aircraft and Personnel. They were now stationed in the U.S. Kearsarge, an assault ship cruising in the Adriatic. Since June 2nd, the men on the Kearsarge had been on standby, ready to rescue me if necessary, but there were several important questions that had to be answered before any rescue effort was launched. The first question was when. Dawn was only hours away. A daylight mission would be risky. The NATO commanders thought because the Bosnian Serbs would easily spot a slow-moving helicopter, if NATO could be sure that I would be safe waiting until nightfall, wasn't it best to delay the rescue until dark? The second question was who should make the rescue. Several commando groups stationed at various places in Europe could do the job, as well as the trap force on the Kearsarge. Which group was the best prepared and could act most quickly? By 2:30 a.m. there was still a lot of talk. Nothing had been decided. As much joy as T.O. Hanford felt the instant I uttered the words Juvats over the radio, it was nothing compared with my own emotions. I hadn't even recognized Hanford's voice. All I knew was that one of the good guys had found me, and my chances of being rescued had just improved dramatically. At last, everyone would have proof that I was alive, and they had my coordinates too. I wasn't sure whether I wanted to scream at the top of my lungs or cry or fall down and thank God. From Basher 1-1's tone, I realized that no one had picked up my earlier beacon signals. I had had lots of fears during those 6 days, but one of my greatest was that my family would never know what had happened to me. Now at least they'd be told I had not only survived the missile attack, but I'd avoided capture. I had done my duty. I had served my country with honor. Basher 1-1 returned around 2:45 a.m., and we made contact on our special alpha frequency. We were both concerned about Bosnian Serb intelligence. I was so close to freedom. By now my get-home-itis had struck like the flu, and I knew this was the time I was most likely to make stupid mistakes. I was also perhaps the most at risk. I remembered the gunfire in the night. The Bosnian Serbs could be closer than I knew. Basher 1-1 asked how I was. When I told him that I was okay, he hesitated, then dealt me a blow that sent me staggering. Magic wants me to pass you the word, he said. Manana. Manana, tomorrow. I couldn't believe it. NATO wasn't going to send a rescue team until the next night. Maybe I should have told Basher 1-1 that I was half dead and that if someone didn't come right away, there might be no Manana. No, I shouted back at the radio. Get me the heck out of here now. Basher 1-1 tried to calm me down. He explained that NATO was assembling a rescue team, but there were risks to be considered. In my military mind, I understood perfectly. Rescue forces like to work at night. With high-tech gear like night goggles, darkness gave them an advantage over a less well-equipped enemy, and in about 3 hours it would be daylight in Bosnia. As much as I wanted out, I definitely didn't want to put my rescue team in needless danger. I didn't want a bunch of men dying just to save my life. Waiting another 20 hours might be necessary. In my heart, however, I was not quite sure. I wanted out now. With all my radio transmissions, I worried that the enemy had surely heard me, and if I wasn't rescued right away, the Serbs would find me. I'd used up enough of my 9 lives surviving the last 6 days. I couldn't afford to chance another 24 hours. Basher 1-1 promised to call me back, and again I turned off my radio. My batteries were growing weaker. Transmission with Basher 1-1 were so faint that many times we had to repeat ourselves. For the next 2 hours, at agreed upon times, we talked on Alpha, but he had no specific news from Magic. He only said that NATO was doing all it could to launch a rescue. Daybreak was coming. I prepared myself mentally to go back to my hole-up site. I would have to live with my disappointment and hope that the Bosnian Serbs hadn't picked up any of our communications. Then, around 4:15 a.m., Basher 1-1 came on Alpha with a glow in his voice. "They're rounding up the boys right now," he said. "The assets are airborne. They're throwing everything they have at you. It's only a matter of time." "Yes," I cheered silently. For whatever reason, NATO had changed its mind. They were coming for me today, right now. I uttered a brief prayer to God and quickly found a hiding place behind a nearby dirt mound. This was hardly a hole-up site, but I could keep low for a couple of hours. Turning on the radio, I accidentally knocked off the volume knob. The knob, which also controlled the on-off function, had been loose since I had first used the radio 6 days ago. But now was no time to have a problem. In the darkness, I spent the next 10 minutes combing the grass before I found it. In my last communication with Basher 1-1, he told me that he had to return to Aviano, but another pilot, Rock 4-1, would take his place and be my eyes and ears in the sky until I was rescued. Basher 1-1 signed off, and his replacement came on my radio within minutes. Unlike the voice of Basher 1-1, I recognized the voice of Rock 4-1. It belonged to Captain Von Littlejohn, a friend of mine who was calm, confident, and steady as a rock, just as steady as Tom Hanford. "Conserve the battery power," Littlejohn told me, "and be ready. We're here for you. We're going to get you out." At 5:45 a.m., Littlejohn came back on the radio to say the rescue craft would be over my position in 10 or 15 minutes. I kept looking around. Dawn was breaking. I could hear cows lowing in the distance and the infernal racket of the herders' bells, but I saw nobody, just in case I had slipped a bullet into the chamber of my Beretta. Before I had been sure I would never use the handgun. Now I was just certain that nobody was going to stop me from leaving. As I waited, I began to realize that the clearing I'd chosen for the helicopter landing was small, maybe too small, to handle a good-sized ship. Maybe a chopper could hover overhead and drop me a safety line. I wasn't about to go searching for another spot, not in daylight, not with the cows and their handlers due to be grazing in the open fields. I scooted behind my mound of dirt and asked God to make the time go a little faster. It was decided that the U.S. Marines on the Kearsarge were the best unit to make the rescue attempt. Stationed just miles off the Croatian coast, the U.S. Marines, once they were airborne in choppers, could reach me in less than 45 minutes. The trap unit was one of the U.S. Marines' best trained, and the unit was experienced in handling dangerous situations from Beirut to Haiti to the Persian Gulf. As long as NATO provided backup air support, the trap commander, Colonel Martin Berndt, had already told Vicenza his men weren't afraid of the daylight mission. The U.S. Marines thought that I'd been in danger long enough, and they wanted to get me out as soon as possible. At 4:39 a.m., the 42 members of the trap force hit the decks of the Kearsarge running. The team was made up of an expert rifleman, field scouts familiar with the Bosnian countryside, electronic warfare specialists, medics in case someone got wounded, and a translator in case communications with the enemy became necessary. Team members prepared for their mission by test firing their M16s, painting one another's faces with camouflage paste, and receiving a last-minute briefing from their commanding officer. By 5:05 a.m., 1 minute before sunrise, they were in their two Super Stallion helicopters, two Cobra assault helicopters with lots of firepower, would escort the large helicopters with the rescue team. The 4 choppers lifted off the deck of the Kearsarge and waited for their NATO air support to come online from their air bases in Italy. The NATO fleet that joined the U.S. Marines was like the Air Force of a small country. F-16 and F-15 fighters, British Harrier jump jets, the kind that can take off vertically and just hang in the air, tank-killing A-10 Warthogs, F-A-18 Marine Hornets with special missiles to take out SAM batteries, and EF-111 aardvarks and EA-6 Prowlers with the electronics to jam hostile radar. 8 flying tankers were sent up to meet all refueling needs. In addition, a set of planes and helicopters would wait, hovering off the Croatian coast to provide any necessary backup assistance. NATO was taking no chances. It took more than a half an hour to assemble all the aircraft, and at around 5:45 a.m., the fleet headed towards the Croatian coast. The Hornets would streak toward me, first flying directly over my sight to verify my coordinates. The Cobra choppers would follow, leading the actual rescue with the 2 Harriers overhead to supply close air support. Once the air fleet was feet dry, they began skimming over the hills and farms and forests, staying low and using fog banks for cover. They were followed by the trap force and the 2 super stallions. The Cobras were only 10 miles from my position and closing in fast. The job of the pilots of the aardvarks and Prowlers was to pick up, jam, and if necessary, destroy any Bosnian and Krajanian Serbs' radar activity. From intel, they knew the location of the SAMs, and they waited to see if anyone would be spiked, as I'd been 6 days earlier. The rescue mission was meant to be as secret as possible. No one was going to open fire unless put in harm's way. The next move would be up to the Serbs. From my hiding place near the clearing, I watched the clouds begin to break up, showing a clear patch of blue. The ground fog had mostly peeled away, but some fog still hovered in the field below. I was on the edge of the mist, shrouded from anyone approaching by foot, but visible to my rescuers. I couldn't have asked for better weather conditions. Suddenly, I heard the welcoming roar of a pair of F/A-18 Hornets overhead. It was a little after 6 a.m. One of the U.S. Marine pilots radioed and asked me to give him my mark. I let him know exactly where I was. His jet streaked off, and not before he promised that the rescue choppers would be there within 30 minutes. That half hour was one of the longest of my life. In my head, I went over the search and rescue procedure 50 times. I could have recited it in my sleep. When I finally heard the jump of the helicopter blades beating in the air, I jumped into the clearing. Trying to control myself, I called in my radio to tell the pilots my exact position in relation to the Cobras. I could see the Cobra attack helicopters through a hole in the mist, but I didn't know if they could see me. The pilot of the first chopper radioed for me to pop smoke. I was ready with my flares and pulled the cap off the first one. Its red phosphorus smoke spiraled up through the fog, marking my position. Within 20 seconds, by the time the flare had faded, I could see the first Cobra directly overhead. "We see you," the pilot confirmed over my radio. The floppy orange hat I had wanted to throw away because I couldn't imagine a use for it, now on top of my head. I wanted to make myself as visible as possible. I popped a second flare just in case and waited for one of the Cobras to land or someone inside to toss me a safety line, but the Cobras remained hovering in the air. It took me a few seconds to realize that they were only advanced ships. Their job was to make sure it was safe for the Super Stallion to land. One of the Cobras dropped some yellow smoke on a field about 200 yards to the south. Suddenly, 2 huge Super Stallions came into view behind a forest of trees. I watched them land just to the south of me. One of the Cobra pilots radioed and ordered me to run towards the stallion. Pistol in my right hand and radio in my left, I began zigzagging through the woods. My survival vest was flopping with my used flares and my compass. Just before I reached the field where the idling stallion stood ready, I tripped and sprawled onto all fours. The Cobra pilot, still on my frequency, urged me to keep running. I'm going, I said as I picked myself up as fast as I can. Breaking through